现在就请马诺博士发言。他发言的题目是贾平凹在西班牙文语境。
好，谢谢。发言之前，我想感谢香港浸会大学翻译学中心举办这次会见，让我们在这里贡献我们对贾平凹先生的文学作品的知识。然后因为我是用英文准备我的演讲，所以不好意思现在用英文发言。So the topic of my presentation here is the reception of Jia Pingwa's work in the Spanish-speaking world. It is kind of problematic to talk about reception in the case of the Spanish-speaking reception context, because actually there is only one work of Jia Pingwa that has been translated into Spanish. This is the only book that has been translated. It's a collection of short stories, and inside you have Hei Shi, which has been translated as La Buena Esposa. So these short stories, this novella is the only work by Jia Pingwa that has been translated into Spanish so far. Also, we have to take into consideration something, and it is that this work has not been translated directly from the Chinese, but through a previous English version that was published maybe a couple of years ago. It's the same collection, and the Spanish version was part of a project by a Chinese publishing house to publish different works by contemporary Chinese authors into Spanish in a large scale. So, given this small reception or the absence of a major translation of Jia Pingwa's work into Spanish, why should we consider talking about reception? So this is why I have suggested in a, let's say in a heuristic way, the concept of proto-reception, because I consider that reception is not limited to the physical existence of a text. Reception also contains a series of social operations, using a word a concept that was suggested by Pierre Bourdieu, and because the circulation of literature and of ideas are also made up of these social operations, it is not necessary to have a text to analyze the reception or the transmission of an author. And in the case of Jia Pingwa, it's very eloquent, because we have a writer who is hugely famous in China. So there is normally there is a understandable interest in the part of potential publishers abroad that could be interested in publishing Jia Pingwa's work. So this is the case in the Spanish-speaking world. I have identified a series of agents that are involved in this process of pre-reception, of transmission, like literary agents, the potential publishers, and also for example, the scouting agency, and the translator and the editor of the volume that has been already translated. And through the analysis of Jia Pingwa's proto-reception in the Spanish-speaking context, we can actually understand some of the features, of the general features of the reception of contemporary Chinese literature in the Spanish language. These features were already identified in a research, in a doctoral research by Marín Lacarta, by Dr. Marín Lacarta. So she identified a series of features that actually fit very well with the case of Jia Pingwa's proto-reception. So, for example, the first feature we can talk about is the indirect translation, the predominance of indirect translations in the flows of literature between Chinese and Spanish. So, according to Marín Lacarta's dissertation, this is a symptom of marginality in this reception. So there is always the necessity of a mediating language, of a pivotal language, in order to create a connection between the Chinese and the Spanish language. Most of the time, this connection goes through English, sometimes through French, but English is actually the dominating pivotal language. It is kind of funny that I have to use also English right now to communicate with you this kind of ideas, but well. So we can see the importance of the English language mediation in the literary relations between Spanish and Chinese in a series of documents that make part of this idea of the proto-reception. For example, what we see here is the catalog that was used by the literary agency that is currently promoting Jia Pingwa's work in the Spanish-speaking world. It's the catalog they used at the Frankfurt and Torino's book fair in 2014. So we can identify a series of elements that talk about this, the importance of the English reception, of a previous English reception. Like there are references to the prizes that were awarded to Jia Pingwa for his work Turbulence. Also, well, the fact that all of the information that is included in the catalog comes from English language sources. So there is not an independent channel of transmission of information between the Chinese language and Spanish language. They all go through the English reception. And also, I contacted with the editor that is up to the date, the main publisher of Chinese literature in the Spanish-speaking world, director of Kailas, a publishing house. And he told me that he's actually waiting. He knows Jia Pingwa's work, but he's waiting for the publication of his works in English to decide whether he will publish his works in Spanish or not. So another feature that gets confirmed if we analyze this proto-reception of Jia Pingwa's work is the documentary value that is given to Chinese literature. By documentary value, I mean that works of fiction by Chinese authors tend to be considered as documents that talk about social conditions or real conditions in China. And this value of this fiction, the works of fiction, is even more important, or is considered more important than the literary value itself of the work. And we can see this, for example, in this is a fragment of Jia Pingwa's profile at the website of the literary agency. So they talk about, well, he and his writing are identified with China's countryside. His subjects range from the effects of modernization on Chinese society, the ancient agrarian sensibilities at the heart of Chinese culture, and also the use of Xi'an and its surrounding countryside as a setting in which to examine China's rural-urban divide. So we can see that the central point is what Jia Pingwa's work tells us about China, rather than more general considerations about literary value. So all these patterns that are very eloquent about the dependence and of the Spanish reception on the English reception should be challenged to create a different channel of reception. And the initiative of this Chinese publishing house is actually a good opportunity to create this independent channel and to provide a different channel for the arrival of the works of Chinese authors into the Spanish reception. But the problem is that, as we could see before with the only work that has been translated into Spanish so far, they are also using English as a mediating language, because marketing and economic considerations tend to be sometimes more important. So it is faster and cheaper to translate from the English version into Spanish rather than from the Chinese directly into Spanish. So it is important to take into consideration these issues about the economy and industrial, the publishing industry, because they are also having much more weight than the literary considerations. And how much time do we have left? Okay. So finally, I would like to address another issue that I think it's also very much related to what we are talking in more general terms. It's about the translatability of Jia Pingwa's work. I think, as we saw this morning also in Yang Huiyi's presentation, and Robert Matheson's presentation, there is a very important debate among scholars of Chinese literature about why Jia Pingwa's works have not been translated into English in a major way. And they tend to consider generally ideas about the complexity of language, as Professor Wang Jingwei has also shown. But I think it is important to take into consideration that even Jia Pingwa himself seems to have considered issues of translatability in his own, during his literary career. So for example, I have here a quotation from Mr. Jia Pingwa, a remark that he made during a roundtable at Peking University in 2013, where he said, 原来的小说里面的方言也不是刻意的，小说里面写的那些生活，乡间人怎么说话，无意识的把它带了出来。后来我就有意识的削减了一些，因为我想尽量写一些让西北以外的人能够看懂的东西，而且让更多年轻的人能够看懂的东西。So here we have a case in which the author himself seems to be concerned about the translatability of his own work, but in this case it's a question of intra-translation. This, on one side, shows us that even within the same cultural system, we have also to make distinctions between different layers. So identity is not something monolithic, culture is not something monolithic, and even within the same culture, we have different layers. So it is even necessary a translation within Chinese culture. And also this could lead us to ask whether now that Chinese literature is going to the world, we should be asking whether the writer Jia Pingwa is going to take into consideration this, let's say, globality of writing and inscribe elements of translatability on a transnational or transcultural level within his literary works. So this is it. Thank you very much.
这个我们在云南平时讲的都是古代汉语，我连现代汉语都讲不清楚，现在又听英语，听得我耳朵都发肿了。这个刚才那个马诺博士讲的这个贾平凹小说在西班牙语境里边的这样一个传播问题，其实是文学可能是属于文学传播学或文学社会学方面的一些问题。但这样一个传播呢，似乎他讲了有个问题，就是说，我们的文学必须根据刚才报告谢老师讲的一些问题，好像我们的文学必须世界文学化，好像我们必须有一种世界文学的力量，要裹挟着我们的作家朝着一个世界文学的方向走。我也是觉得，所有的文学都是用方言写作的。所有的语言都是一种方言。如果站在世界的一个各个民族的这样一个视野当中来看，所有的方言，所有的文学都是用方言写成的。所有文学当中最精彩的部分，也是方言写成的。所以在这样一种裹挟下呢，有一种非常大的一种危险。刚才我看到一段话，听到一段话，就是说，就连贾平凹先生都觉得他要削减他的方言的这样一种浓度或者说这样一种程度然后去适应一种普通话写作吧。应该如果方言的相对称的，就是一种普通话写作。那么我们的一种普通话写作，实际上普通话这个的历史。包括它的语音、它的语词，以及包含在语音和语词结构当中的它的一种语义的诗性的这样一种内涵，这个历史是非常短暂的，只有几十年的历史。而我们这个所谓的中华民族，我不说汉族，中华民族的使用汉语的中华民族，它使用汉语的历史是非常的悠久和长远，非常的古老的。我读贾平凹先生的一些作品当中，比如说他写的一些陕北的一些歌谣当中，呢仍然保持着最古老的语言发端的时候的，比如说《诗经》作为北方文学的一种代表的一种笔性传统之类的，这样非常的生动，非常的精妙。那么这样的传统当中呢，如果我们为了适应一种语言的环境，用西班牙语或者英语或者法语或者德语的一种语境，削减我们的这样一种民族语言的这样一种最面向世界的时候，它生发出来的一种特殊的交流方式，或者在诗意生发当中的一种非常特殊的这样一种锦绣的这样一种文学风格，那么我想这是一个非常危险的问题。所以文学传播和文学的一个翻译这个东西，我觉得应该最大充分的尊重这个。实际上，事实上，只要最伟大的文学、最美好的笔意，就像最灿烂的阳光和最碧蓝的天空一样，所有的人都会感到心旷神怡的。比如说，我现在读贾平凹的小说，他有一些笔意，比如说那个太阳从那个瓦檐上滚下来，这样的一些笔意，那是我觉得你就翻译成任何一种语言， 有诗意心灵结构的人，会很快就会抓住这样的美好的比喻，把它创造为他内心世界当中的锦绣光华。所以我觉得这个是我们值得研究和思考的一个很重要的一个问题，在翻译过程当中，如何保持一种文学的，这是我们思考的问题。哎，还有看有没有什么问题啊？那个倪若晨教授。
我想问一下 Manuel, I might as well use English, I think. You said that the Spanish publisher was waiting to see what was published in English first, which is, I mean, a very interesting situation. I just wondered whether you could say a little bit more about that. Why would the Spanish wait to see what the English did first? I mean, why isn't it possible for Spanish people in Spanish literary publishing to kind of make their own decision? Thanks.
Yeah, I think it's generally because they do not like to take many risks. So the previous publication in English is already a guarantee that the work is feasible as a translation, and at the same time that it's economically profitable. So if they have the reference of how the work behaved in another market, a similar market, because obviously the French or the English-speaking markets are closer in their characteristics to the Spanish market. So like this, they can be sure that the investment that they are going to make on the translation, the editing, and the publishing of the work is going to be a good deal. Mm-hmm. So maybe there is an economic considerations, like really weighing on this, the necessity to see a previous publication in another language.
Mm. I mean, Spanish tastes, I mean, are there any areas where they would be different from English-speaking tastes? I mean, perhaps not with Jia Pingwa's novels, but for other novelists. Are there things that have been translated into Spanish which have not been translated into English?
You mean in the case of Chinese literature?
Right.
Yeah. Like in the last years, we have seen a considerable or comparative increase in the number of direct translations. But the pattern still continues to be like maybe half or most of the half of the translations from Chinese literature published in Spanish tend to be indirect translations. So the thing is that now the number of translators available is increasing. And for certain authors, like for example Mo Yan, now it's, let's say, it's not a risk to publish Mo Yan because of the Nobel Prize. So now you can actually take the risk and pay for a direct translation, which is going to be more expensive, but you know that it's going to be profitable. Mm-hmm. And also I think that it's helping the fact that because of the financial crisis, and this is only applicable to the context of Spain. In other Latin American countries, maybe the situation is different. Mm. Even though most of the publishers in Latin America tend to be Madrid or Barcelona-based publishers, so in terms of the publication of Chinese literature is kind of the same. But the thing is that with the financial crisis, we have seen the emergence of a series of independent publishers that are completely separated from the dynamics of the big publishers. So these small publishers are more, or tend to be more braver when they publish literatures such as Chinese, because they tend to have more interest in the literary value of the works rather than making big profits with the publication. So this is a new channel of transmission that is rising right now, and I think it's really promising in that sense.
And they can obviously, sorry, I'm hogging the conversation. They can obviously survive, can they? These these very small ones, you'd think in a way they would be less able to take risks because they can just go under. But they seem to be actually prepared to take on more risk, even though they are small and perhaps have less resources.
I mean, like inspired the big publishers.
I mean, you're saying that the small publishers are actually taking risks, right? But they have less resources. So in a sense, it's almost more risky for them to take a risk than it would be for a big publisher.
Yeah, but the margins of benefit that they seek are smaller. And normally the process of edition is more, let's say, homemade. So they don't really have to pay that much, for example, in the distribution or even in the translations. I know cases where translations are made by people close to them or friends. So this decreases the expenses of the publisher, like in a really considerable way.
Okay, thank you very much.
Welcome.
好，谢谢那个。我看妮子，下面请来自美国杜克大学的罗鹏教授发言。
Just to add a comment, so Spanish publishers are waiting for American publishers or English language publishers. I translate Yan Lian Ke's novels. The American and English publishers are waiting for the French publishers. It's very annoying. They can't give anything to me to translate until the French edition has already come out and they've seen how the French edition is done. And so we're always like a year or two. I translate from the Chinese, but we're always like a year and a half or 2 years after the French. 就是他是说那个西班牙出版社总是在等那个英文世界的出版社才可以决定要不要把一个中文小说翻译成西班牙语。而我反讽的是，最起码我翻译的眼连课的小说，我那些英文的出版社，英国也好，美国也好，他们要等那个法国的出版社，就是那些小说先要在法国出版，然后他们才会决定要不要要一个英文版，所以我们都是。落后于那个法国出版事业一两年，就是特别烦人的事情。
刚才想加一句那个其实有一个法国的，就是研究世界文学的学者 Pascal Casanova， 他写了那本书里边就讲到这个法国是中心的这种有带这个含义。当时很多人就是不以为然，他觉得这是一个欧洲中心论。那现在其实 Carlos 在证实，那他说的话是对的。
好，下面请 Jessica 发言。
谢谢李生。Thanks, Carlos, for bringing that up because I was thinking, actually, Myelin is here and Sonia Au is here. They both working very closely with French publishers on French translation of Chinese literature. I wonder whether we might get a bit of information from them. 我谢谢罗鹏讲刚才法语的翻译的问题，因为今天我们其实 Myelin 也在，Sonia 也在，他们两位都是跟法语的出版社，尤其是对研究中国当代文学的翻译，其实是有非常丰富的经验跟认识。不知道能不能两位也讲一讲？
好，对。
谢谢 Jessica。不敢说我有很大的研究，可是我跟那个 Mariam 也是同一个老师的。我们老师是Isabelle Rabu， 他是沈从文还有余华的翻译家。那他们怎么去找那些中国文学的作品去翻译呢？很简单，因为我们的老师跟中国大陆的学者。还有那个最主要是跟那些作家很有联系，就是说像余华他写一本小说，我们老师就很快就知道他什么时候写好，然后就很快看到他的作品，然后也是很快去一年 1年里面他写好了，好几个月以后他就可以把中文翻译成为法语，所以法国的那个对于当代那个中国文学是很敏感的，因为有很多专家去跟中国大陆的那个怎么讲，那个作家很有联系，而且他们常常看中国作家的那个作品。那我想我讲到这里，我把那个交给我的同学Mariam讲一下。
下面就请那个马亚莲博士进行本场合早上的那个马拉松和Jessica 的发言的总体回应。
我还要继续说的那个 Sonia 说的，我要说，在法国，我觉得第一个区别是那个翻译家跟作家的关系很好，但是除了这个以外，还有出版社的关系。当然，出版社很重要。在西班牙没有专门出版中国文学的出版社，在英国、美国也好像没有一些大学的出版社在翻译也在出版那个中国文学，但是在法国有，而且那个伊莎贝拉·布负责一个中国文学的出版社，那他有那种 resources 怎么说有很多，他有很多办法可以。除了那个跟作家的关系以外，也很容易出版他翻译的作品，这个也很重要。因为比如说，如果我跟一个作家的关系很好，然后很快翻译成他的作品，我没有办法，我很难找到很难在西班牙找到一个愿意出版那个作家的作品，因为那个出版社会跟我说我要先看一下英国人还有美国人出版什么作品，然后我来作品，因为你的作家可能没有那么有名，我不知道这个，还要先读一下那个作品。那很多出版社负责的人都不会看中文，那他们要先看用英文、用法文看那些作品，然后决定翻成西班牙文，是这样。那我很不好意思，我的古代汉语没有那么好。你说在英语不是，我今天准备的我现在要回应那些3个不同的人的报告，他们都说了发言但是因为我的英文比我的中文流利，那我现在用英文吧，明天用中文吧。So the 3 papers that we have listened to, I remind you that I am replying to this morning Jessica Young and Chris Mattison's paper, and then Xiao Jiwei 老师 and Manuel Pavón-Belizón's paper. Okay, so these 3 papers have addressed similar questions from different perspectives, basically questions about translation, literary reception, and world literature. Both Jessica Young and Xiao Jiwei have mentioned the difficulties and limitations of translating Jia Pingwa. Manuel Pavón, at the end of his presentation, also mentioned the difficulties of translating dialect, Fayen, and Li Laoshi responded to that. So Jessica Young has focused more on the difficulties of understanding the everyday ethics of the characters in Jia Pingwa's novels in northwest China, especially the ethics of the female characters. And she has shown us that their actions and attitudes can be difficult to understand for someone who doesn't know the traditions or the rural ethics and local customs. Xiao Jiwei has focused more on the formal experiments in Jia Pingwa's novels and specifically in Qing opera, and how this is related to these difficulties that she has mentioned can be seen as an obstacle for translation, and global recognition. So she has mentioned character names, multiple characters, complicated intersecting relationships between characters, the non-legendary and non-dramatic plainness in plot. And it's interesting how this, especially the part about the complicated characters and the intersecting relationships, have also been mentioned as being qualities of Jia Pingwa's writing this morning specifically. So very often the challenges and difficulties are also part of the qualities of a literary work. At the beginning of the presentation, Jessica Young also mentioned that she was not going to talk about Howard Gobler's translation because it was beautifully done, and maybe looking at those beautiful passages, the beautiful parts in the translation, would be also a way to show how linguistic or formal barriers can be overcome. And there is space for translation. And as a translator, of course, I think that linguistic challenges and formal experiments can be translated. In both Jessica's and Xiao Jiwei's presentations, one important issue that has caught my attention is how we defined world literature. And Jessica pointed this out in her presentation. So are we talking about the technologies of recognition, such as literary prizes, the numbers of books translated, numbers of books sold, or are we talking about a more romantic definition related to how the reader travels to a new world inhabited by characters that experience life in a different way, making the reader learn about them and enlarging the inner world? And this has been mentioned also by Professor Eo Yang this morning. Xiao Jiwei also mentioned the limited presence in American in America of Jia Pingwa's works and of rural literature, Chinese literature in general. So if we look at the more romantic definition that I just mentioned of world literature, everyone here is sure about how jazz work contributes to world literature in that way, opening a new world to the reader and making the reader feel sympathy and understanding for the characters. And Professor Xu was mentioning in the previous panel, he can write about anything. He has written everything, you know. But the concern mentioned this morning about Chris Mattison and also mentioned by Manuel Pavón is why his work has not been translated until now. Chris Mattison has shown an optimistic and positive future, especially if we look at the future of English translations, which will probably affect the future of Spanish translations, like Manuel Pavón was saying, because of this dependence and this reliance on what gets translated into English being translated into Spanish. And then Chris Mattison mentioned, and Manuel Pavón also mentioned, different agents. Chris mentioned translators, publishers, and the audience. And he highlighted the responsibility of publishers, and I agree with that. And Xiao Weiji also mentioned that it's not the author's responsibility, right? That not being translated, it's not the author's responsibility, or it doesn't mean the work is problematic. So the situation, I would like very quickly, just the situation in Spain and in France is different to the Anglophone in the sense that more translations are published, okay? Because Chris Mattison was mentioning this 3% of works being translations. But of course, even if more translations are published in Spain and in France, only a very little percentage is Chinese literature, okay? like I just said, in France there are publishers interested in exclusively publishing Chinese literature, which makes a big difference. So I can understand why they're waiting, like Carlos Rojas mentions, they're waiting to see what gets published in France, right? That's not the case in Spain, as you can guess from Manuel Pavón's presentation. So we also find this phenomenon that Chris mentioned this morning, that only 1 or 2 authors get published and they have the monopoly. Of course, the Nobel Prize being, you know, one of the important factors. And I would like to say, I could talk for hours about the Spanish situation, but I'm not going to do that. I would like to say that the collaboration between translators and publishers is the lack of collaboration is the big problem in Spain. So Spanish publishers go to Frankfurt, to the International Book Fair, and they choose and they pick books that have been translated in English and French without collaborating with people who can give them recommendations. So to conclude, as a translator, as I agree with Jessica Young, that we should not care about the limitations that she mentioned or that have been mentioned today, and we should just translate Jia Pingwa's work and publish it. This will bring the literary work to a new readership, which means there will be new readings and new interpretations of Jia Pingwa's work, enriching both the reader's perspective, so the reader's world, but also enriching the life of the literary work and giving new the opportunity to have new readings on that literary work. Linguistic and formal limitations and difficulties are there to challenge the translator, and like I said, they are very often also part of the qualities, and that's what makes the job interesting too. Thank you.
今天这个活动不光是香港浸会大学的翻译学研究中心主办的，其实在校内还有罗桂祥老师当主任的创意与专业协作课程合办，还有我们的中文系。但是代表我们给最后的感谢词的是倪若成老师。
好，贾平凹先生，各位贵宾，各位老师，各位同学，女士们、先生们。 大家好，今天的研讨会就要结束了。虽然只有短短的1天的时间，其实没那么短。但是在短短的1天之内，我们的讨论非常丰富多彩，对贾平凹先生作品以及作品通过翻译在世界上的传播。 进行了深入的探讨。有这么多的作家和研究当代文学的学者能够欢聚一堂，一起讨论和交流，真是极为难得的机会。虽然研讨会快要结束了，但是明天我们还会有机会，继续思考我们今天涉及的问题，因为。 大家都能看得到，明天下午2点钟，我们的5方对话活动就会在这里举行。那么欢迎在座的各位参与。在会议结束之际，我仅代表浸会大学翻译研究中心对各位。 参与研讨会的贵宾以及合作单位表示衷心的感谢。首先，非常感谢贾平凹先生。有您的参加， 对我们是很大的荣誉。还要感谢我们的合作单位，动物学术林建法先生，还有中国社科院陈仲义教授，很可惜陈教授今天无法参加。也感谢贾平娃研究院的同事王立志院长，不知道在哪里和玛丽秘书长。也感谢香港幼校的专家同事刘建梅教授，还有徐子东教授。也非常感谢所有的其他的远道而来的贵宾。本次会议的成功，当然也要归功于浸会大学各方面的努力。那么这里感谢文学院院长陈志教授的大力支持。他可能不在。感谢浸会大学这个研讨会组委会的巨大努力，就是那个 organizing committee。那么其中包括人文及创作系的罗桂祥教授，中文系的蔡元峰教授 Dr. Howard Choi 他上课翻译课程翻译研究中心的邱伟平博士。那么当然还有特别感谢我们翻译课程和翻译研究中心的杨慧义博士，他可能是负担最重。我们还要感谢今天和明天在现场帮助我们跨越语言障碍的口译员，潘军博士。Daisy Ng 博士，Pierre Wang 先生，以及杨慧义博士，还要 mention 还有浸会大学音乐系的黄全峰博士，他会在明天为我们维吾尔族作家 Mem Timim Hosher 先生做维吾尔语口译，而且在香港找一个维吾尔语口译员是非常难的。好，会议的成功也离不开各位工作人员台前幕后的努力和付出，其中有我们的行政人员，包括林源先生，Paul Chan， Saipullah Mutalib， 他是Karina Lock 女士，Cherry Chow 女士，都是我们翻译课程的。也有博士生李慧民和 Enoch，Enoch 在这儿。也感谢我们的研究生和本科生给我们帮了很大的忙。我特别想感谢翻译研究中心的 Esther Kwok 沃克斯，他刚刚进来了，他更是承担了大量繁杂的后勤组织工作，所以非常感谢他。而且要 好，那么今天我们的研讨会就到此结束，所以最后再次感谢各位的光临，希望明天在5方对话上再见到你们。好，谢谢。